you see free market dynamics start to incentivize the proper usage of energy in Bitcoin mining. And I think that's going to continue to be the story, at least in the US, because demand response in the US is a great way to make the grid more robust, improve the efficiency of the grid by reducing what we call, there's a demand curve.
Welcome to The Feedback Loop, a Sino Global Capital podcast where we keep you in the loop about the most pressing issues in Web3 today. I'm your host, Mona Hamdy, a Harvard teaching fellow with 20 years of experience in nonprofit and sustainable development. I started using emerging technologies 15 years ago, working with remote peoples to create new economies based on the reversal of climate change. And today, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sino, where I hope to bring beneficial technologies to the most forgotten corners of this planet. Today, I'm joined by Nick Hansen. He's the co-founder of Luxor Technologies, which needs really no introduction in our world. They're a leading Bitcoin mining company. We'll have a lot to talk about. The current state of crypto mining, the environmental concerns that we hear about everywhere all the time, as we should, and the potential role of mining in secondary energy markets around the world. Lots to talk about. So we'll get right into it. But let's start, Nick. What got you started in the mining industry? How did you co-found Luxor?
Thank you so much for the intro. My name is Nick Hansen, the CEO of Luxor. And I've always had just a really just an interest in crypto as a whole. So back in 2014, my introduction to crypto at the time was just Bitcoin, because it was really the only one that existed. I take that back. That was really the only one that anybody really knew about. Once you learned about that, there were all these other derivatives like Namecoin and Peercoin and Terracoin and all these other derivatives of Bitcoin. But anyway, I got very interested in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining specifically, mostly because at the time I was like a hobbyist computer builder, and building at the time, the only way that you could mine Bitcoin was with GPUs, and so I was building these multi-GPU. Effectively, they're just computers, and I built them into milk crates, which was kind of the way you would do this. A milk crate actually fit perfectly to hold maybe 5 or 6 GPUs. You put the motherboard on the bottom of the milk crate, and then you hang the GPUs off of the little racks that are effectively built into a milk crate. So that's how I got started in Bitcoin mining. I filled up my basement in Colorado with these, and it was great because I effectively put in-floor heating into a house that had a basement. So my floors were always very warm because the basement was 95 degrees, but it was all because I had 15 or 16 GPUs running down there. That was right around the time that ASICs started to come out. ASICs are application-specific integrated circuit. So when somebody says ASICs, they are talking about a very efficient type of mining machine. ASICs actually are a general term. There are ASICs in your phone. There are ASICs in my watch. There are ASICs probably in this microphone here. They're just a very, very specialized type of chip that you use for a specialized type of compute. In this case, what we're trying to do is compute SHA-256 hashes very, very quickly, and at low energy. The lower your energy consumption per hash, the more efficient your mining machine is. So anyway, back in 2014, all of my GPUs became obviated by ASICs effectively. At the time, it was Butterfly Labs and KNC Miner. And once that transition started to happen, moved all those machines over to different coins. Like Litecoin was one that wanted to be ASIC resistant, so started mining Litecoin instead, and then started getting into some of the other stuff that goes on in crypto. And that was really my exposure early on. Very much a hobbyist. From 2014 to 2017, I had been working at Salesforce as a lead member of technical staff on Einstein, effectively building Alexa for Salesforce. And that was during the day, but at night was very interested in continuing to figure out how can I take the skills that I was learning as an engineer at a big tech company and apply those to Bitcoin. What I found was we could start building a mining pool. And if you go and Google Luxor today, that's what we're known for. We have a lot of other products that we can get into, but that's a little bit about how I got into crypto and specifically Bitcoin, and how Luxor somewhat came around as a result of that.
What's really interesting about what you're saying is that we've seen a resurgence of exactly this. So your origin story, that's almost a decade ago. Yeah. We're looking at, I'm seeing the same stuff happening on Telegram groups in Lebanon, for example. And that we're seeing a resurgence in that. And we're seeing that in areas of the world where infrastructure, financial infrastructure and social infrastructure and physical infrastructure are shaky. There's a resurgence and an interest and an adoption of this at global scale.
How do you reconcile those two, and where do you see this going?
The thing about Bitcoin mining is that it will continue to decentralize itself. And the reason for that is energy is sparse. And what we mean by that is that energy is somewhat equally distributed. There are definitely pockets where there's more energy than others, but it's generally equally distributed just due to the way, the sun hits the earth pretty much equivalent over a very long term. So that energy ends up getting absorbed in different ways, in different places. So with that in mind, Bitcoin mining will over time continue to be decentralized. And when I say over time, not like over the course of a year. Obviously, right now it's becoming very centralized in the US, but as new energy sources and new ways of extracting energy become available, there are places where the type of energy that we use in the US become obviated by more sophisticated energy production. So, for example, the Middle East could be a phenomenal place to do solar type of solar mining. As solar prices continue to drop, the cost of producing solar continues to drop. Places in Africa are using water. Hydropower. There's a really interesting story of a company called Gridless that's using hydropower to offset the cost of putting in what they call micro generators or micro hydro generators. The cost of those are quite high, and it's amortized over a pretty long schedule. And so you end up paying like $1 per kilowatt. For contrast, here in Seattle, I'm probably paying somewhere between 8 and 10 cents per kilowatt. That's generally around the norm for residential rates here in the US. So they're paying like 10 times that cost in small villages in Africa. You come in and put in some Bitcoin miners to use the extra energy that isn't being used during the day. And sorry, I guess I didn't explain. They come in and put in a 50 kilowatt generator, but that thing costs, let's just say $1 million to install. Then they amortize that $1 million over 10 years or whatever the number is. But you're paying for the capex, the capital expenditure to install that generator, regardless of whether you're using the energy from it or not. And so the reason it's important to use Bitcoin mining in that sense is that when there's not a lot of fridges or air conditioners or high energy consumption devices in those places, but they do need energy, but maybe they don't need 50 kilowatts today. So you can bring in Bitcoin miners, take up the latent capacity and offset that cost. So in this way, in this very specific example, we're effectively using Bitcoin mining to offset the cost of bringing energy to small rural areas that have a river flowing through them and that you can hook up a hydro dam to, a micro hydro dam. Micro hydro dams are the size of a small shed. So those are, that's just one of the many, many ways that I see mining continuing to be decentralized and continuing to expand into areas where traditionally it wasn't.
Let's stay here. I have so many questions to ask you about the state of the industry at the miner level. If we're looking at declining profitability, bankruptcies, miners dumping Bitcoin, hash rate going up, putting it in that global context of what those startup costs are, or like at the nation state, we see a lot of, to your point, we see a lot of in the GCC, LNG and sweet crude producing nations who are looking at Bitcoin as a sort of effective use of that secondary and residual energy, and how to offload some of that and maybe even return some of that to the grid, right? And these are in places where we had energy subsidies that are declining and swiftly so over the past decade, which is a new way of being or a new way of relating to energy production in the Arab world. And coincidentally, the place where we have pretty reflexive and maybe even encouraging signs of not just blockchain or crypto adoption, but actually in terms of facilitating and incentivizing mining, right? Writ large on the individual level and on the nation level. But bringing it back to Seattle and bringing it back to what's happening here in the United States and maybe reconciling those two, what's the state of the industry and the state of, your Bitcoin miner today?
There's multiple classes of Bitcoin miners. You call them like the hobbyist or retail miner. You can mine at home, generally somewhat profitably, but a lot of miners that mine at home aren't purely profit driven. They want to get what's called KYC free coins. They want to get coins that come directly from the blockchain that don't go through an exchange or anything like that. They don't have the taints of being spent a bunch of times. So there is an attractiveness that is outside of pure profitability of mining at home. And so in that regard, I call that somebody that has like maybe up to 5 machines. 5 machines would use somewhere around 15 kilowatts, which is quite a lot. Most homes in the US are built for up to around 20. So you're really maximizing you're really kind of using up what you could do in a residential environment. Then you get into more of like your small mid-sized miner that says, okay, I can't really build out much more at my residential unit. I need to figure out more of a commercial space for this. I can either go to a hosting space or acquire my own hosting space somewhere near where I live. And generally that's like the next step in the mining, kind of in mining, especially in the US. Folks that say, okay, I want 100 miners now. How do I get that? So they go to a company like a Blockware Solutions or a Compass or something and get those machines, and they get a hosting contract with them. And then you get into like the mid-sized big miners. Those are companies that are built around Bitcoin mining. A lot of times they have some other profit model as well. So like, for example, a lot of miners here in the US are using what we call controllable load resourcing or demand response to offset the really high prices that can occur in unregulated grids, specifically ERCOT. There are other unregulated grids in the US, but ERCOT is really the prototype for this. There are incentives for them to say turn off when energy prices are really high. A good example was in January of this year, there was a winter storm in Texas. Bitcoin miners pretty much exclusively came offline during that couple of day period because energy prices were really, really high. And so you see free market dynamics start to incentivize the proper usage of energy in Bitcoin mining. And I think that's going to continue to be the story, at least in the US, because demand response in the US is a great way to make the grid more robust, improve the efficiency of the grid by reducing what we call, there's a demand curve. And basically, like at night, there's a very little demand. In the middle of the day, or around the time people get home, the demand curve gets very, very high. And we're starting to see Bitcoin compress that demand delta. So the delta being the difference between the top and the bottom amount of demand. And we can see Bitcoin mining starting to compress that delta. The reason that's important is because it makes it much easier to build the grid and understand what the demands of the grid might be. And what I mean by that is that you have to build the grid for the absolute maximum demand, even though 99% of the time you're below that amount of demand. So if you can reduce that delta, you effectively improve the efficiency of the whole grid by making it easier and more efficient to build into that grid. So that's an example of like the mega miner.
If you were able to talk to a utility provider at a national scale, where they're looking at building this infrastructure in terms of load offset and management and calculating what Bitcoin mining would do to their infrastructure. What guidelines, what advice would you give them to calculate that to figure that into their calculus today?
I think the big one is looking at your demand curve. Every grid is different, and the demands of each particular grid have their own unique constraints and properties, and also understanding what your grid mix is. Like, for example, in Texas, there is a lot of solar and wind, and those are intermittent. And so you don't know, today, maybe the wind is blowing, but in 10 days, you don't know if the wind is going to blow or if the sun is going to shine. So in that way, you have this intermittency from your renewable sources. So you need to have what they call a firming base load. So it depends on if your grid has a firming base load. So a lot of places have, say, a coal plant that they use for basically filling, in the middle of the night, the absolute bottom amount of energy needed is usually going to be filled by coal, probably or natural gas. The reason for that is because it doesn't rely on weather patterns, things like that. We are seeing Bitcoin mining start to incentivize nuclear technology, which is really, really important for overall reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, coal being, Coal got us to where we are today, but unfortunately its time is coming to an end, and that needs to be replaced by some other type of firming base load. And that really just comes down to understanding what your grid and its constraints are. So, let's just say the UAE or Bhutan or any of these countries come and ask the question, you would need to understand a little bit more about what their grid actually looks like, what their grid mix is, and start to build a strategy around how you would introduce Bitcoin mining into that ecosystem. There's a lot of places that have a lot of latent energy, meaning energy that's unused or entirely or completely wasted. Bitcoin mining is a great way to monetize that energy, which in ways can bring more stability to the overall ecosystem of energy production in those environments, but also they may have, much higher or much lower demand curves, where controllable load resourcing may not be as important in Bhutan as it is in Texas, but there is latent energy that could be monetized in another way. So it's not just controllable load resourcing. It does also just come down to the uniqueness of the grid and how that grid operates. Again, back to the sparseness of energy. There is no grid that's exactly the same. They've all been built over hundreds of years, maybe not over 100 years. And so all of their constraints are very different. And then also the energy mix in those areas is going to be completely different. In Canada, they use a lot of hydro in various places, a lot of hydro, and a lot of natural gas, but they don't get a lot of sun. So that means the way that grid operates is going to be very different than, say, Texas. So that's kind of what I would say if somebody came to me and asked, what would you do with our grid? How would you introduce Bitcoin mining into our grid?
How do you see things like, uncollateralized lending, or the price per kilowatt, or even just the price of procurement in places like Latin America, Asia, Africa?
Uncollateralized lending, especially in Bitcoin, is there's not a lot of uncollateralized lending. There may be under collateralized lending, which is what we saw happen in 2022, when over time, the collateral that we were using is highly correlated with the market. The collateral we were using were the mining machines themselves, which reached like an all-time high in 2021. And so people went out and got loans on the value of those machines. Then the value of those machines went down by, say, 80% on a dollar value, which means all of those loans were, all of the covenants on those loans were triggered, which required them to be topped up. So in that way, they were collateralized, but very under collateralized as the market shifted. So we were very correlated with the price of Bitcoin in the overall market. Looking at price of acquisition, as you mentioned, in different locations, the US has one of the highest, probably one of the highest prices of acquisition, highest capital expenditure cost due to tariffs. Just overall, everything is more expensive here. But in other countries, generally, it's more of a boom and bust cycle. So during the bust cycle, we start to see machine liquidations, or just infrastructure liquidations in general, and a lot of the least efficient machines end up going to those lower cost environments like Latin America. That's where the prototypical machine from 2016, 2017 was called an S9. And those machines now are really not profitable to mine anywhere. And during the transition of those machines to later generations through the S17 series and the S19, the S19 is currently the prototypical model. Those S9s were getting shipped down to Latin America, places where energy is cheap or effectively free, more or less. And that's that's the way that these markets start to evolve over time, and the way that the mining machines themselves migrate from higher cost environments to lower cost environments.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of the global sort of energy per kilowatt measurement, that map that went through the mining community last year, that showed that Kuwait had the lowest cost. And yet you saw, because of all of those other extenuating factors, it also had one of the lower rates of adoption and the most high friction environment in terms of procurement or in terms of mining. How do you find out what you know about about the grid or the grids that you'll be interacting with? How does Luxor get its alpha, Nick?
Specifically to Kuwait, one of the reasons that a lot of folks aren't willing to ship machines to, even though they may have the lowest energy price, a lot of folks or companies, investors are not willing to ship machines there, is because the regulatory environment is uncertain, and the rule of law may not apply. And there's risks of nationalization in a lot of different countries where, what happens if I invest $100 million in an emerging economy and the government there decides that, they want to take those rigs over. That's a huge risk, and a lot of folks are not willing to take it for that lower cost. The reason the U.S. people pay a premium here is because of the strong property rights. It's very hard for the government to seize any of your assets because of just the way that our laws are structured here. And there's a lot of other countries where that applies as well. Now, how does Luxor get its alpha on these different opportunities? So Luxor doesn't actually operate any mining machines ourselves. We're a software services company, and so we don't really get that alpha, but we are always looking for places, we don't get the benefit of that alpha per se. A lot of our customers do. And so we end up telling a lot of our customers, like, this is what we're seeing in the market. And a lot of that comes from just being engaged and very involved in not only the US, but also around the world, and trying to understand what are the constraints, what are the limitations of each individual environment that we're going to operate in, or that our customers are going to operate in. How can we maximize the value for our customers and give them that alpha? And so really it just comes down to being really in tune with the market, having boots on the ground. We have people that travel around to different places a lot and try to gather that intelligence and understand each of the local ecosystems. Like, it's not just power price. Like, there are places in the world where you have to, famously, some of the Eastern European countries had some of the lowest power costs, but you effectively had to pay the mob to keep your machines from being stolen. That's just a fact of the world. Maybe it's not the greatest, but that's just the way it is. There are other places where, you have to be very involved with the local government, or the local government will, shut you down or whatever. But if you get some special treatment from the local government, that's another, place where you can, generate some alpha. So it's very much regional, and it's very much based on each nation that you're operating in. And so there isn't like a playbook for this.
You just bought Ordinal Hub. What was the alpha on that?
Ordinals are just individual Satoshis. There's something called ordinal theory, which states that each individual Satoshi, there are 2.1 quadrillion of them, can be individually numbered and identified based on a numbering scheme. And that's what ordinal theory is. Ordinal theory has been around for years. The idea that you can individually number them, it's somewhat like it's kind of like novel, or there is no real numbering scheme in Bitcoin, but you can apply some logic and get to an individual numbering. And so that's what an ordinal is. Really, the key unlock that caused this to become, the fever dream that it is now, maybe not fever dream, that's not the right word. The fervor, to be the fervor that it is now, was this thing called inscriptions. So an inscription is some extra data included in the witness portion of the transaction. Witness is a portion of a Bitcoin transaction that can include some extra data. You can include random data, which includes like art. So people have been putting JPEGs and PNGs and different art into this extra data. The key unlock there was that you can assign an ordinal to be the owner of an inscription, and then that makes it transferable. So now I can transfer an ordinal from me to you, and if there's an inscription on it, then you also receive the ownership of the inscription. And so what that produces for Bitcoin is effectively an ecosystem of NFTs. And so now we have NFTs on Bitcoin, which is one of the largest markets out there. That caused a lot of drama. A lot of folks were very on the fence about whether this is proper use of Bitcoin block space. Bitcoin block space is maybe the most scarce resource in the world. With this witness data, you can only put 4 megabytes worth of transactions into a block, which is not much. Like, if you load up Instagram, you're using way more than 4 megabytes just to load that up. So one picture can easily be 8 to 10 megabytes, and even some of the biggest pictures are multiple, tens of megabytes. So you only get 4. And then you're also competing with the globe on getting those transactions in, and so. In that way, we've started to see like this super scarce market for block space. What does that mean for Bitcoin? So Bitcoiners traditionally don't like NFTs. The Bitcoin people of the world don't like NFTs. They think it's like a trivial, it's like a toy that should not be on sound money. Bitcoin's thesis is that it's sound money for anybody to use. And if you're using up that precious block space for minting JPEGs, very high value transactions can't go through, like what we call financial transactions can't go through. And so that's the argument against ordinals and why it was so controversial. I think we've gotten to the point now where, in general, the majority of the Bitcoin ecosystem has come around to the idea that ordinals are not really that big a deal for the Bitcoin network. The reason being is that financial transactions are much, much, much smaller than NFTs or NFTs on Bitcoin. And so even though it costs relatively 5 times more to put a financial transaction in, it is much, much less than an NFT because it's so much smaller. The reason that's important is because we pay based on the size of the transaction. So if a financial transaction is 1/100th of an NFT transaction or an inscription, then you pay $1 for one, you pay $100 for the other. Relatively, those numbers are vastly different. Of course, you should be, most Bitcoin transactions can be done for a few cents if transaction fees are low. And so that's, anyway, that's one of the reasons that people have been against it. But I think we've gotten to the point now where everybody's somewhat okay with it.
Yeah, I found it really interesting for Luxor positioned, as it is. I mean, again, you've said that in terms of, the software offerings, in terms of where you sit sort of in the ecosystem, to really, I really saw the purchase of Ordinal Hub as a statement. And then in terms of a really strong signal about where you see the future, actually not just industry, but of, positioning Bitcoin as a sort of in the taxonomy of what Bitcoin is as its classification.
The very first week of like Ordinal Mania, we minted what we called it's called a big wizard. It's a picture of a wizard that pointed to a Discord group, and it's called the Big Wizard. It's a Taproot wizard, which is an NFT project on Bitcoin. And the reason that's interesting is that it's a 4 megabyte block, meaning it's one transaction. So the entire block was taken by one transaction. And the reason that's interesting is because you have to be a mining pool to do that. Your node will reject any transaction that's more than 400 kilobytes. So you have to go directly to a pool. We had to make some changes to Bitcoin Core to introduce that transaction into our mining pool and then mine it. So that was sort of the beginning of the craze. And so around that time, there was this website being built called ordinalhub.com. And that was like the de facto place to go and learn about new NFT, new Bitcoin ordinal projects. And so the idea was, immediately, like I was using it every day to like go learn about new projects that were coming. I was friends with the person that was starting it, and then when new projects were coming to me asking like, how do I get listed on Ordinal Hub, it started to click that this thing is going to be a very attractive property. So within a week, we had decided like we're going to try to buy it. A little bit of history. The OpenSea during the last bull run when NFT, they were doing $1 billion in volume. They were an incredibly valuable business. Still probably one of the most valuable businesses in the space. But they were probably a $12 billion industry, or just business, not industry, business, in the last bull run. That's what they raised at their last round at, was $12 billion. So I was looking at that. I was looking at where we were at in the ordinal cycle and saying, even if we get to 10% of that size, this could be $1 billion business. So took a swing and decided we're going to jump into this. Like I missed NFTs the first time. I will admit that I still don't quite get it. Like I'm starting to get it now, but like I don't quite get the why somebody would pay $5 million for a picture. But really, it starts to make a lot more sense when you put it on Bitcoin. The reason being is that it has a very strong ownership and permanence structure, where some of these other chains, you're embedding a link to something else, where in Bitcoin it's actually in the blockchain, and the Bitcoin blockchain will vast outlive me, most likely vast outlive humanity because of the way that it's built. And so in that way, it's very, very attractive to have something inscribed there that demonstrates, a generational permanence. Nothing like this has ever existed before. So in that way, it kind of unlocked for me. And so I decided I'm not missing NFTs again. It's here. It's in my ecosystem, which is Bitcoin. I love Bitcoin. I get to now take part in some of this. And so that's the reason why we went out and acquired Ordinal Hub, and have pretty much done a complete rebrand and restructuring of that entity. Right now, the goal for Ordinal Hub is to be a place to explore and discover new projects. We call discovery is like learning about new projects that are coming. Explore is digging into projects that already exist. There will be marketplaces for Ordinals. There are a few that exist today, but there is by no means the infrastructure that the Ethereum and other L1s have for NFTs. Solana, Ethereum, Polygon, Arbitrum, et cetera. They all have way, way better infrastructure for their NFT ecosystem than Bitcoin does now. And so I'm just trying to see where is this going to land? And that's why we haven't jumped all the way in on the marketplace yet, is because it may be fundamentally different than the way some of the other ecosystems operate their marketplaces.
When I first saw Ordinal Hub, I tend to look at permanence in a community or a society as one of the benefits of all that's on top of our species. And when I saw the Luxor Ordinal Hub affiliation, I thought, this is where, and I say this 11 bajillion times a day, so our team is probably tired of me saying this, but I'm always looking for the Fortress of Solitude. That's that cave where Superman goes. Like his whole civilization has exploded, and he has all of, in this cave, the ancestral wisdom, the permanent wisdom of Krypton in this one place, right? And so were it not for the limited space factor, what was interesting about all of the arguments and justifications for Ordinal Hub and for using Bitcoin in this way was exactly that. And so I think that there's probably, do you know what I mean? And so I think that
absolutely
is so valid. And we don't have the compute, we don't have the processing speed, we don't have the maybe ecosystem around to really understand what that means. But I thought it was a really interesting use of that space, was that we turned it into a toy. Once humans start playing with something, we turn our tools into toys. And when we do that, we really start to get really creative about what we do with it. So I was pretty excited to see that. What it also does, though, is it changes the classification of what a Bitcoin is, what the space on it is, how we move it, and how we use it. And that brings us right back to the United States and to your thinking about this. So not just in terms of mining it, but in terms of the types or the taxonomy of what it is as an asset. Do you ever see a world in which the state of mining regulations in the United States will be counterproductive? Are you worried about what you're seeing? Do you think that you can ever see mining or Bitcoin be considered a security, for example?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's already precedent set that mining is not a security. Also, I do think that over time we'll start to see, like, Bitcoin is already considered a commodity. That's been ruled on. So it'd be very, very difficult for that to happen. More broadly, what you're mentioning. So I certainly don't think it will be considered a security, and I don't think Bitcoin mining will ever be considered a security.
And I know it's such a reductive and primitive. I know it sounds almost silly to ask, but just in a world where things are being redefined and re-examined, and we're looking to the United States, it's like, how are you seeing this play out? The
regulatory environment of the US is actually very, very attractive, regardless of what the media says. It's very attractive. And that's why all the investment is happening here. Underneath the covers and underneath the facade of like the political the political dialogue is a very attractive investment environment. And so that's why all of that is happening here. Certainly, there are things that can occur that cause that to change. There could be regulation, and so for example, there are some entities that in the past have tried to filter out of their mining what we call OFAC sanctioned transactions. So these are transactions that include addresses that are on the OFAC sanctions list. The OFAC sanctions list is like, these are entities that have been sanctioned by the US government, and you're not allowed to do economic activity with them. And so there were entities that tried filter those out of their mining operation. What that effectively does is make that miner less competitive. Right now it's meaningless. It's less than 0.0001% of mining reward. But in the future, if that definition starts to expand of rewards or of transactions that need to be filtered, then there is a real pressure on Bitcoin miners in the US that they will become less competitive with the market just naturally due to the regulatory environment here. And so I think in that way, regulators, and that's something that I tell regulators when I talk to them, is like, this is a very attractive environment to continue fostering growth. You want it to happen here. If you start introducing regulations that make it more difficult, they will just move, because there's nothing stopping Bitcoin miners from operating anywhere other than the environment that they're operating in. So they'll just move. Bitcoin is a global currency. You can opt in anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a particular jurisdiction. So I would just say that, that's really my approach to these discussions, is that this is a global currency. It doesn't have to happen here. We should get it. We want it to happen here, though. We want this activity to happen here because it could be, and probably in my opinion, and most Maxi's opinion, be one of the most important innovations of our generation. And if we opt ourselves out of it through regulatory overreach, that would be a huge misstep for the US and allow somebody else to take over that narrative.
What do you make of Biden's 30% tax, 30% crypto mining?
So I honestly think it's going to be I think that's more of a signal of the administration. I think that is a signal to the market that this is where this administration stands. I'm certainly disappointed to see that that's the signal that they want to send. I don't think I don't think it will go through. I think there's a lot of precedent set already that would make that illegal and unconstitutional. And so I don't think that it will ultimately end up going through. And so in that way, I just think that it's, like I said, it's just a signal to the market, that the Democratic Party, was a Democrat up until very recently. It's just, that's the stance that the Democratic Party is taking. I don't fully understand it. It doesn't make sense to me why they would do this. But that is the stance that they're taking.
More stance on energy efficiency as opposed to state of crypto or state of mining per se. You think it's a signal on the environmental?
I think it is. Yeah, I certainly think it's a signal on the environmental properties that have like the environmental impact and the properties that Bitcoin mining have had on the ecosystem, and that's really more a narrative story. Like Bitcoin mining is done almost exclusively with renewable energy. Like I shouldn't say exclusively. There's still a lot of greenhouse gas emitting energy sources that Bitcoin utilizes, but in general, the places where Bitcoin mining flourishes, it's places where energy is by far the cheapest, and the cheapest energy now is generally renewable sources. And so in that way, I think, we really have been trying to flip the narrative and I shouldn't say even flip the narrative, just demonstrate the data that proves that Bitcoin mining incentivizes renewable energy generation. I have a piece that I wrote about a year ago about how I think Bitcoin mining is going to save the world, and the main point there is that it incentivizes renewable energy, or I call it sustainable energy generation, meaning energy generation that will last longer than 100 human generations, and those are primarily hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear energy. Those are all really clean ways to generate energy, and Bitcoin mining flourishes on all of those. And so by having this spire of first and last resort for that energy, we then see that Bitcoin mining incentivizes more production of those generation sources, which over time will start to permeate into local grids and start to permeate our everyday lives and start to push out those greenhouse gas emitting types of generation.
For many reasons, one of which is that your company is called Luxor and I'm Egyptian.
So one of the projects very early on that we were interested in was a coin called Saya coin. Saya is an Egyptian god. And I don't really know the ties to Saya for that particular project, but we were building something for that project at the time. This was in 2017. And I just thought it was kind of cool. And then they started to build a mining machine manufacturing company called Obelisk. And so that's like two references to Egyptian culture. And so when we were building the company, at that time, it wasn't a company, it was just a hobby. It was like an idea. We didn't call it anything at the time. So when we decided, okay, this is like starting to become a little bit more formal, we should come up with a name for this thing. We started looking around at different kind of Egyptian-y themed things. We were like, could we call it pyramid? But that was like a terrible idea. You don't want to be called pyramid scheme. And then like all of the other like Egyptian names are very hard for English speakers to spell or even pronounce. And then my wife was like, my wife was looking around and she saw a picture of the Luxor casino and was like, isn't Luxor like a town? Isn't Luxor a town in Egypt? And then looked it up. Yeah, it's a town, and also the name of an obelisk. So, which I think is in Paris now, unfortunately, but that obelisk. So, what's that?
It's fine. We claim it. We claim all of them. I'm bringing them all back.
So having an obelisk called Luxor and then there being a town, it all just kind of started working out. So we called ourselves Luxor. And then, we do have, there are a few we have like some internal naming that is, has some Egyptian callbacks. So like we have a development environment called Cairo. But then we kind of started going down like ancient city names. So then we have another development environment called Carthage. All these different, kind of Mediterranean historical terms that we just use. Every company needs to have like a naming scheme internally. Previous company I had like types of beer, so they would call like servers like Pilsner or Helles or Hefeweizen or whatever. Another company had like shoe brands. So they had like Nike and Adidas and like so. Anyway, we needed something
cooler. You've got like Persepolis. You've got
We were gonna try to do something with Pharaoh, but I tried spelling Pharaoh 5 times. I couldn't get it right 5 times in a row. So I was like,
that messes you up all the time. That's
always in the row. Yeah.
Always.
So anyway, we've gone down that, we do try to, be respectful and realize like we don't want to appropriate all of Egyptian culture, but we do like to have, of course we have the pyramid here a little bit, which is a nice little, or kind of a pyramid, a nice, tribute to Egyptian culture as well. So yeah, it's been
always
top of an obelisk as well. Yeah, we have a lot of those, like Mediterranean, North African type of cultural references within Luxor. And so, yeah, it's been, that's how we got our name.
Well, I dig it. Have you and your wife or your team ever been to Egypt in the real Luxor?
I have not. No, it's very high on the list. Have not been yet. We got to go.
Yes.
There's not a lot of
Egypt. You guys have to come. That's it. It's happening.
As of now, almost all of my travel exclusively revolves around going to like Bitcoin events, Bitcoin mining events. And so all the places that I've been have been as a result of that. So we need to do like something big something big in Cairo. Well, I really appreciate it. This has been great. These very, very thoughtful and intelligent questions that really put me through the exercises today. So I appreciate the content, appreciate the incredible questions.
Well, thanks so much, Nick. I'm a fan of what you guys do. I'm excited to see what you do in the space, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you in Egypt.
Our time is up for now, but the conversation is still going. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Sino Global Cap, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave us your feedback so we can loop it into upcoming episodes.